I'm Reverend Father Professor EMMANUEL Kojo Ennin Antwi of the Department of Radio Studies, Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Kumasi, Ghana. I would like to first of all thank the organizing committee for throwing the invitation to me to contribute to the discussion on the millennial woman and the question of inclusion. When I saw the theme for the conference, one question that came to mind is that, are women excluded from the society? Is that possible? Women are never excluded from the society because we can never imagine a society without women. We can never imagine a society without our mothers, our sisters, our wives, and our girlfriends. However, in the course of time, we've recognized that there has been a historical accident in such a way that woman has been presented in images that seem to discriminate against them in the society. We have some narratives which rather seem to favor men more than the women. And one of those narratives we have are found in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. So I decided therefore to give a presentation on the place of woman in Judeo-Christian thought, impacts, challenges, and hermeneutical attempts. My presentation will follow the following outline: introduction, religion and gender, gender from the Judeo-Christian perspectives, and from the Judeo-Christian perspectives, I will rely mostly on the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then I'll look at the impact and changes in contemporary society, and then look at the hermeneutical attempt to reverse this narrative. There is this popular song called People's Court by a Jamaican musician called Muta Baruka. And in this song, it is clear that religious belief is accused of abuse against women. I'd like to quote a statement from the song. "You have painted a picture of women as the originator of sin. You have made women look inferior to all your religious books. From Eve till now, you have blamed women for the downfall of the world." In this particular song, Muta Baruka painted a picture whereby religion is taken to court and is being accused of sins against women for painting them very black from the time of Eve. And this song, of course, is an anti-colonial song whereby some Jamaicans, we see most of their songs which are anti-colonial and speak against colonialism. Religion, as a matter of fact, has had a lot of impact on cultures everywhere, because religion is seen as one element, one important element of the social structure of the society. And religion influences the behavior and attitudes of adherents. When you hear about fundamentalism, fanaticism, etc., coming from certain sects and religious groups, we see that is as a result of the impact that their religious beliefs have on them, and that is why they act in that way. And it seems that religion has painted a picture of an ideal life for its adherents. For instance, people have the belief that when we live good here, we will live better in the life to come. So because of these ideals in religion, people are more conformed to the ideals of religion and go strictly by their teachings and conform to their practices and their ethics. And as a matter of fact, Religion has transformed the cultures of the colonized people. If you talk about Christianity, before the advent of colonialism, Africa, most part of Africa, like where I come from, Ghana, had the African traditional religion. This African traditional religion had a lot of values. However, with the advent of Christianity, colonialism and Islam, most of these traditional ethics and values are being eroded away. And Christianity, as it was imported into other lands in Africa, for instance, also affected so much the colonized territories. Now, looking at gender, one thing that we need to understand is the fact that gender is a construct of the society. It is a cultural construct. It comes from the society. And gender is in reference to the roles of male and female. We need not confuse gender with sex. When you talk about sex, you are either born a man or a woman, and there's no way you can change it. And then when you look at the roles that men and women play, since it is the construct of the society, as the society develops, that also changes. And because of that, it differs from society to another society. Let me give an analogy by using nature and culture. We could see that when you talk even about a tree, wherever you find a tree, whether in India, in Ghana, in Europe, wherever, it remains a tree. But when it comes to culture, it is our response to the environment, our response to nature. And as a result of that, when it comes to the use of tree, Ghanaians will be making stools to sit on. Others will be making chairs in different sizes, in different shapes, and whatever forms. And because of the fact that that is our response to culture, it also differs. So when we talk about nature, man will ever remain man. But when it comes to the roles that we play, if it is a construct of the society, then as the society also grows, that also changes. Now, let me move on to religion and gender. If you are looking at the history of religions, we recognize that most of the founders are described as men. Most of the founders are described as men. So we have a lot of male predominance in religion. Let's talk about even religions today. Most of the leaders are males, are men. Talk about in Islam, you have imams. Talk about in Christianity, now currently we have other women who are also priests. But you take, for instance, the Catholic Church, for instance, which has made a rule strictly that women can never become priests. We don't know what happens maybe in future. Let us also talk about monks that we see in other Eastern religions and all that. I have been seeing all along men who are rather monks. So we begin to see that from these perspectives, the roles of women are being overshadowed by that of men. But one thing that we see interesting in African traditional religions is the fact that in terms of the priesthood, the African traditional religions do not discriminate against men and women. Men could become priests, women could become priests, but more often than not, these are not discussed at all when it comes to discussion on religion and gender. When we take sacred scriptures, African traditional religions have no sacred scriptures. They have the oral traditions and etc. that they receive from their ancestors, which more or less form, so to say, oral sacred scriptures for them. We come into Abrahamic religions and other religions, we recognize that sacred scriptures play very essential roles in their religion, and they can never be done away with. And in the case of the Abrahamic religions, we have Judaism, we have Christianity, and we have Islam. Judaism, when they have their Tanakh, Christianity, have their Bible, Islam, have their Quran, they believe that these scriptures are inspired. It means that these scriptures originated from God. However, one fact that we need to know is that these scriptures originated from God, of course, but in putting them down and in transmitting them, it was rather human beings who actually transmitted them. As I stated earlier before, the Judeo-Christian scriptures have had great impact on cultures worldwide everywhere. I'm hearing that even in countries whereby they are not Christians, some are taking advantage of Christmas also to do their business, etc. Let's even talk about dating. Now it is a common, we are using the common era. But in natural fact, when you take this previously, you were using before Christ in the year of our Lord, whereby it has become so common. That's the Roman calendar for us all. And then there are other symbols which are also accepted internationally and everywhere. Let us take the symbol of the snake for healers, for medical doctors, for pharmacists, whereby you see the snake as a symbol actually originated from the snake, the serpent that Moses raised when they were in the desert. Now, if Christianity has a tendency of influencing the society, and in the society we have men and women who play various roles, then there's the tendency that Christianity could also influence gender to some extent. Now, when you talk about the Judeo-Christian scriptures, we have the Christian Bible. I'm using the term Judeo-Christian in the context that the Christian scriptures, so to say, you have the two sections, the Old Testament, which Christians inherited from Judaism, and then we have the New Testament, which also evolved from the early church. Now, taking these together, whether we like it or not, Christianity has had a lot of impact from the Judeo-Christian scripture, Judaism, or the scriptures from Judaism, whereby we have a lot of motifs in the Old Testament which are found in the New Testament. And Christians believe that the Old Testament, so to say, is a promise, and then the New Testament is their fulfillment. However, if you look into the scriptures, you recognize that the content of the Bible is full of male dominance, and thus seemingly pointing to discrimination against women. But is this the case? Let's see. When you think about the Bible also, there are some who have discussed the Bible to such extent that we deduce also certain elements of the Bible which seem to oppress other people. We can talk about slavery, for instance. We can talk about colonialism. We can talk about apartheid, which all emerged from the so-called Hamitic origin of people, whereby we begin to see that the black race or other races who descended from Ham were in actual fact cursed. So looking at this, there's no two ways to deny the fact that the Bible, whether we like it or not, has had impact on societies in most countries in the whole world, so to say. Negatively and positively, that's why we need to note. Negatively and positively. Negatively and positively. And now, looking at this, how do we assess the impact of the Judeo-Christian scriptures on gender? In the Christian Bible becomes the basis for Christian teachings and practices. It is very normative. There's no way Christians can come up with dogmas, doctrines, etc., practices without making reference to the Bible. And as I said earlier on, you look at the content of the Bible, which is full of male dominance, which actually point to the discrimination against women. And if you take the whole society, let's look at the impact of colonialism on the world. Let's talk about Africa, North and South America, and some parts of Asia, which were colonized by the Europeans. Because the Europeans had Christianity as part of their culture. If you look into the social structure of Europe at that time, Europe in the past, we recognize that their main religion, so to say, was Christianity. And as they went along to other places whereby they colonized, they went along also with their religion. And at the end of it all, most people, so to say, became Christians. Let us talk about Brazil. Let us talk about Nigeria. Let's talk about whereby we have big influence of Catholicism in this area. Now, within this, we have leadership roles in line with androcentric sentiments in scriptures. It is the scriptures, so to say, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, which actually became the normative scriptures for their colonized territories. And when you look into these scriptures, and you have the androcentric sentiments, whereby men are, the narratives of men rather put them in a higher position than the women, then there is a tendency that the discussion on gender is also going to be affected. Now, I'd like to look into why we have this. Because within the Old Testament and New Testament, we have some androcentric sentiments, which in actual fact influence their teachings, practices, and etc. I would like us to go through some of these from the Old Testament perspectives. One thing that we need to talk about is the creation stories. When we take the creation stories, we have two. We have the Yahwehistic account, that's Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 to 25. And then you have the priestly account, Genesis 1, 26 to 27. When you take the Yahwehistic account, for instance, here we see in the narrative whereby man was created first and woman was created second. So some have taken the advantage to say that since man was created first, man is superior to woman. However, in the same narrative, if you look at it critically, we recognize that God took a rib from the man in order to create woman. And some discussions have gone on looking at the rib. Why the rib? In actual fact, he never took anything from the head, as man would be superior to woman. And he never took anything also from the feet, as woman will be, as man will be inferior to woman. However, he took the rib, which some believe is a sign of equality. So in this regard, we see that man and woman, so to say, are created equal. And another point that we also need to understand from the narrative is that before the creation of woman, man was put to sleep. And what is the significance of that? If man, someone who is put to sleep, which means man was rendered passive and he had nothing to do with the creation of woman. And therefore in this context, there would not be any need whereby man will create a kind of man who see himself to be superior to woman rather, sorry. And then the second account, which we have the priestly account, Genesis 1. In this account, if you look at Genesis 1, 26 to 27, this is where man is created in the image of God, in the image and likeness of God. In this context, we did not see in the creation story whereby God was creating man before creating woman. It's like they were all created at the same time. That's how the narrative will present to us. And none of them were created in the image of God, image and likeness. So which means man has the imago Dei, and woman also has the imago Dei. So in this context, therefore, we do not separate to say man, so to say, is superior to woman. One narrative that has also created a lot of problems for the understanding of the gender, the role of woman, is the fall narrative. In the fall narrative, it looks like Eve was accused because she was the first who took the fruit. And if you look at certain narratives, what others have written, if you go through some of the church fathers and their presentation about woman, you will see most of them to be very negative because of this fall. But one thing that we need to point out is the fact that these people who were developing these narratives were trying to communicate to us in a human way the divine truth. They were trying to communicate to us in human way the divine truth. And we need to understand that the human language is not so perfect. So within this context, a lot of miscommunications, a lot of misinterpretations have dwelt on these texts. The Yahwehistic account of creation and then the fall narrative we have in Genesis chapter 3. Another point that we could also discuss is that in the Old Testament, the priesthood was reserved for men, because Aaron and his sons were those who were supposed to be priests. And so to say, the terms of the priesthood was reserved for men and not women. And this actually has also caused a lot of confusion. When you get that, later on you get to know the developments that have come out of this, and people are now changing, even having women as priests in their churches. Now another element that we see, that inheritance was also reserved for men. Inheritance. And as a result of that, those who died without having sons had to marry their brothers, their husband's brothers, in order to give birth to a son for them. But however, in this context, I already said, I remember there was one instance whereby Moses gave a kind of dispensation to one family whereby the man died without having any son, and then some concession had to be given for the women, for the daughters, to inherit the man. When you talk about census, I think when you read some narratives and you get to know census and women were not counted. Women were not counted. We look into also genealogies. We look at the genealogical narratives that we have in the Old Testament also. We recognize that in most of them, you see, not even most of them, so to say, it's all men. However, when we look at these, the men, sometimes there's a tendency to ignore the narratives on women in the Old Testament. Of course, there are some heroines. They have the matriarchs. When you talk in the Old Testament about the patriarchs, we have also the matriarchs. We have Sarah, we have Rebecca, we have Rachel. We also have women who played significant roles in the Old Testament. Deborah, Esther, for instance. But sometimes because of the male predominance, we begin to think that women were neglected. No, women were not neglected at all. When it comes to the Old Testament narratives, women were also praised in a higher position, and positive narratives were, also given to them. The narrators describe them in positive picture. Let us now go into the New Testament. The New Testament. As I already pointed out, the Christians believe that the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. It's a fulfillment. So here, for the Christians, the Bible without the New Testament is not complete. And the Bible without the Old Testament is also not complete. So they have the Old Testament and the New Testament. One thing that we see very interesting in the New Testament is that we have a lot of reversals. What do I mean by the reversals? You see that certain teachings which were given in the Old Testament, you come into the New Testament and these teachings are being reversed. They are being reversed completely. Let's take for instance, in Matthew, when we begin with the genealogy, you have the two accounts, one from Luke and one from Matthew. However, when you take the one from Matthew, we recognize that in the list given, we have 4 women who are mentioned. And these women have, so to say, certain, in my own, a sort of clear type of description in the Old Testament. One, let us talk about Tamar. Tamar, that was Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah. And at a certain point, when she recognized that the father-in-law has actually deceived her and not given her the younger brother of her deceased husband, then she disguised herself, slept with the father-in-law. This is Tamar that we see here. And eventually we also have Rahab. Rahab is the one, when they went to Jericho, the prostitute, and eventually the spies had to go and sleep at her house. This Rahab is also mentioned, this prostitute, in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And you have Ruth, the Moabite, also more or less a foreigner. If you look into all that, you see a foreigner and a woman is also being added to the genealogy. And then we also have Bathsheba, though her name is not mentioned in the text, it is implied, the wife of Uriah. And eventually, the wife of Uriah, so to say, Bathsheba gave birth to Solomon. And discussion of Solomon and its significance to the history of Israel is something that we can avoid. So in this case, we recognize that these women have already entered, more or less have been listed in the genealogy here, looking at it as a form of reversal of the Old Testament teachings. And when we come into the New Testament, we have the role of Mary in the Gospels. And for Catholics and other churches, they hold Mary in high esteem. So we have Jesus Christ, yes, the Son, who is the Savior, who is the Redeemer of mankind. And then Mary, who, so to say, is also playing a significant role in the salvific plan of God. So just as in the four narrative, you had a woman there. So in the salvific narratives also, we have a woman and Mary, and that must also be looked at. Then within the infancy narrative, you cannot ignore the role that some women also played in the infancy narratives. We can talk about Elizabeth, we can talk about Anna. So all along in the New Testament, women have played significant roles, and the narratives give positive elements about women, the role that women played. Now, let's move on to other reversals in the New Testament. The New Testament opens with the book of Matthew. And now Matthew begins with genealogy. Right after the genealogy, we see one figure, though a male being used. A male being used to reverse some Old Testament motif. And this particular personality is Joseph, the foster father of Jesus, the husband of Mary. And now you look at Joseph. The narrative will present Joseph as a decaus, a just man, a righteous man. But then in going through the Old Testament, you recognize that the just man was the one who, so to say, knew the law and observed it. That was the righteous man. And so Joseph is described in this particular context, saying that he is just, he is righteous. But let us see the actions emanating from his righteousness. Joseph immediately recognized that Mary had taken a seat. Mary was pregnant. Joseph decided not, so to say, hand her over to be judged and stoned to death, because Joseph thought that he had committed adultery. And the law, what did the law prescribe for adultery? The wife must be handed over and be stoned to death. However, Joseph decided to divorce her quietly, secretly. More or less, looking at this, the Old Testament type of righteousness is being reversed here. It's being reversed here. And now, when you think about this story, no wonder you go into the New Testament and there Jesus was reversing a lot of things about the Old Testament. For instance, when you go into a "but I" statement, Jesus will be talking about certain things, quoting from the Old Testament, using, and then eventually, for instance, you as you've heard, in the Old Testament, in the olden days, it was, an eye, it was taught an eye for an eye. But I say, even when somebody slaps you, you give the right cheek also to the person, the lex talionis. So here we see a kind of reversal within those stories. So within the Old Testament, so to say, we have a lot of reversals of the Old Testament teachings. Now let's see how this also, this is applied within the context of women. We have a lot of stories of Jesus whereby Jesus was praising women. Talk about Luke, the widow who offered all that she had. So we look at some of the narrative Jesus gave. You could see some of the narrative, so to say, praising women. And even women were included in the disciples of Jesus Christ. there were some women who even ministered to him, more or less contributing from their resources in helping their ministry. And you could also see actually women being involved in Jesus' ministry. Let us take the role of even Mary Magdalene, who was even the first to recognize that Jesus has resurrected. Jesus has resurrected. So she was even the first person to actually announce the message of resurrection. And that's, so to say, is very significant to Christians. The role that Mary Magdalene played was very significant, and is very significant to Christians. Because for the Christians, the resurrection is almost everything. If you look at, there is no way Christians avoid the teaching of the resurrection is very prominent in the Christian belief. Now we have some complications. We have some complications in the New Testament, and in this complaint we have the problematic text. However, we don't have to look on the fact that women were, so to say, included. At a certain point, when Paul was trying to look at the various society, now there's no more slave, there's no more master, there's no foreigner, there's no Gentile, there's no Jew, there's no woman, there's no man. We are all, so to say, one people. But there are some problematic texts whereby women were forbidden not to speak in public. But I think when you look into this, you see that it is actually stemming from the androcentric, so to say, androcentric culture of the Jews at that time, whereby women were not supposed to speak in public. And for that, I think Paul was trying to make a kind of concession for these women who are no scandalous, so to say, to men who have actually come into the community. We look into the early church. In the Pauline corpus, we find a lot of women also playing some significant roles in the early church. We can talk about Lydia and others. Now, looking at all this, let's go into the impact and changes in contemporary society. Now, with new, not say interpretation, earlier on we need to understand that in the course of time, the interpretation of the scriptures have gone through a lot of stages. The interpretation has gone through a lot of stages. Let's talk about the apostolic era, whereby the apostles were using the rabbinic form of exegesis. We have the patristic era, we have the medieval era, we have the time when even historical critical method was born and all that. And now, a lot of critical studies are being done on the Bible, and certain things which hitherto we did not understand are becoming so clear to us. So, if you look at other Christian groups, for instance, we have changes in the priesthood. We can talk about the Anglican Church. We can talk about the Methodist Church. We can talk about the Presbyterian Church and others that we have. We will see that now priesthood is not just a result of the men. Women could also become priests. However, in the Catholic Church, which has dwelt so much on the traditions of the church, reserves that to men. But sometimes when you look at this, I always ask myself, is it a problem that is that the fact that women are becoming priests and women are not becoming priests? Is that to say that men are holier than women, or etc.? I always keep asking myself. Now, even in the Catholic Church, though some see the Catholic Church to be so conservative on the priesthood, there have been a lot of changes with regards to the roles that women play in the Catholic Church. Earlier on, women were not even allowed to become readers in the Catholic Church. Women were not even allowed to become masters. But now, you see women reading in the Catholic Church. We see masters being women and girls. We have all this in the Catholic Church. And then we also have some change denominations in Judaism. There are other sects of Judaism whereby we could also talk about female rabbis, etc. So with all this, whatever is going on, when we talk about women being included from Christianity, or so to say, women being excluded, I don't think that is the case now. Because now, as we speak on, women are playing a lot of roles in Christianity. Even in the Catholic Church, whereby we begin to see the priesthood only as a result of men, women are having other roles that they play in the church, which are very significant to the survival of the church and the society. Now, I am moving on to my last discussion on the hermeneutical attempt. Why the hermeneutical attempt? I already explained to you that due to the androcentric nature of the society at that time, and the sacred scriptures, where the word of God, so to say, which were written by human beings, and they wrote them in human language, they wrote them in human language that needed interpretation. And in the course of time, some interpretations, so to say, have favored men more than the women because of the androcentric nature of the society at that time. But now let's see what is happening to reverse this particular situation of the androcentric nature. We've had what we call the feminist groups. We now have women theologians from different continents. We have women exegetes who are studying the Bible as well, and there are other methods which have evolved in the course of time in the critical study of the Bible. For instance, you can talk about the Christian feminist exegesis, which in natural fact is also accepted in scholarship. In the feminist exegesis, this is what it actually is. It is, and I read, it is a scientific engagement with the Bible with the intention of contributing to the emancipation, liberation, and empowering of women, as cited by Matha. If you look at this, what does it mean? So previously, because of the androcentric nature, we perceived that woman, the place of woman, was not given a place, the rightful place in the scriptures. But in actual fact, these forms of, it's not so to say, because these feminist entities are women, they just want to bring out certain rules in order to favor, so to say, the women. I don't think that is the case. And now, one practical things that have taken place in the course of time is that language is very, very important. And language is used to communicate. So when the language, so to say, is not well communicated, there is a tendency for miscommunication, misinterpretation, and thus, so to say, I find as the means that has contributed to the problem, whereby we begin to see that Christianity, and as a matter of fact, its sacred scriptures discriminate against women. Let me ask you this question: what is the gender and the sex of the Christian God? How do we attribute sex or gender to a deity? This question we need to answer. But now, this is what I personally see. This is the supreme being. This is the supreme being. And we have the consciousness of the existence of this supreme being. But how do we communicate? How do we present him to the society or to human beings? And definitely, we needed to use the human language. And therefore, since it was androcentric, this, so to say, calling God, giving the title as man, and etc. and etc. But if you look at most of the descriptions of God, so to say, you could see that God is so motherly. And in our Akan culture, one term that we use to describe God is Obatampa. Obatampa means a good parent. And a good parent, we use that of the mother. Obatampa. So to say that God giving a sex and gender to this supreme being, no. It is for the purpose of getting language and being able to communicate in human language to people, and that is why we use this. So the fact that God, some are now claiming that God should also be called mother. For me, God is mother to me. I don't have problem. because God is nicer to me, just like my mother was. Let's look at now another thing which is being done now. In terms of language, certain things are being done in order to present God, present the role of men, the role of women in good language in the Bible. So now you have what we call the gender inclusive language in translations. For instance, the New Revised Standard Version is translated in such a way that we have gender inclusive language, so that this gender inclusive language, so to say, would tone down the perceived discriminations that we have against women. Now, in terms of discussion with regards to the creation narratives and all that, much emphasis is being put on the Imago Dei, especially the priestly narrative on creation, whereby man and woman, so to say, were created same. But one thing that we also need to understand from scriptural perspective is that these are narratives that people have sought in order to communicate divine truth. The stories, as we say, there are some which are even fictional stories in order to communicate a divine truth. So, looking at this, the most important thing that we need to reduce from these narratives is the theology that they seek to communicate, the image of God they seek to communicate, and how they present God and his dealings with man. That is the most important. So now, emphasis is being put more on the narrative, on the priestly narrative, with much emphasis on the Imago Dei. And as I bring my discussion to close, I would like to just give my conclusion with regard to the place of woman in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. This is what I see from the presentation and from my studies. There is a perceived discrimination against women in Judeo-Christian scriptures due to some interpretations. That fact we cannot ignore. A lot of discussions have been made on that, a lot of debate and etc., whatever, with regards to the role of women. But one thing we need to know, the woman has a very significant role in the sacred scriptures. Can we talk about the sacred scriptures without women? Can we talk about Jesus Christ without a woman? Is it not a woman who gave birth to him? We can never talk about all these big figures of men and whatever. It's women who, so to say, gave birth to them. So we can never ignore the role of women in the Judeo-Christian scripture. The roles are there, but just that due to some misinterpretations, these have not been highlighted, and therefore there is what we call a perceived discrimination against women in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And then, looking at the situation currently, if gender is a cultural construct, and culture also evolves, and culture is dynamic, then there is a likelihood that in the course of time, gender could also be influenced, as we've witnessed in other churches which hitherto they do not have men as priests, but now they are having men as priests. In other churches whereby women, so to say, had no role to play, but now they are having other roles to play. So I bring my discussion, my presentation to a close by saying thank you, and may God bless all of you.